Good afternoon, YouTube. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be working with some Nepenthes. Well, you know what? We're actually going to be working with some Nepenthes potting mixes because I am going to go through some of the ingredients I use in my Nepenthes mixes. So I'm going to show you a few examples of plants, I'm going to show you a few examples of potting mixes, and I'm just going to go over sort of what works for me. Now, I will say there is many different ways to repot Nepenthes. They're very, very versatile plants. Just because it's working for me doesn't mean it's going to work well for you, and just because it works well for you doesn't mean it's going to work well for me. So I'm just going to go over some of the stuff that works well for me because I can't go over what works well for you. So without further ado, why don't I just get going on this. We're going to talk about a few different Nepenthes and what they need for potting media, and then I think in the next video I'm actually going to repot that Nepenthes hamada. It's pretty much time. The hamada is starting to vine and been in that pot for nearly 2 years, so we're gonna work on that next. But for now, let's look at what we have in front of us. So the first thing we need is a quality sphagnum moss. I like this brand here. It's a New Zealand brand. There's some that comes out of Chile as well. And the Chilean moss breaks down faster, tends to grow weeds in it, and just overall isn't as good. Behind you I have a whole bunch of 5-gallon buckets with these ingredients in. But yeah, I'm a big fan of this moss. So that is my main ingredient in most of my Nepenthes mixes, if not all of them, is the sphagnum moss there. So look for a New Zealand brand if you can find it. What else do we have here? Okay. There are two kinds of perlite. I use perlite in every Nepenthes potting mix. So this is your traditional perlite. It's fairly fine. I like perlite because it's good for aeration. I do like the coarse stuff better, and I'm going to tell you why. Because perlite is meant for aeration. It helps keep the media fluffy. It's a nice inert organic substance. It doesn't go rotten. It doesn't break down very easily. So it's great in the media, just tends to work. But if you see this stuff, it is quite small and it gets quite close together. There's not much air in between there. So I like to track down this stuff, which is called popcorn perlite. It is much, much bigger. Whenever available, I choose this over the other stuff just because it stays nice and there's lots of air between it. It stays good and chunky and works really well in Nepenthes mixes. So that's popcorn perlite. You don't want to mix sizes either, because if you do mix sizes, and I'm not going to mix much because I don't want to wreck my popcorn here, but if you mix sizes and put some of the small in with some of the big, all it does is actually fill in all the air holes and makes it worse than ever. So you don't want to mix sizes too much. All that little stuff would just go right in between all the big stuff and make it so that the big stuff was basically not doing its job very well. Other than those two, and sometimes I just use straight sphagnum and perlite in my mix. Works really well. For years and years I used Douglas Fir Bark, which is this stuff here, and I would put it in for the same reason as the perlite, just to give it some extra aeration down there to keep it from going. The moss on its own goes pretty compact, so you want to keep it nice and fluffy if you can with this. Provides lots of air spaces. This is fir bark. Around here it's Douglas Fir Bark, but the trouble with fir bark, this is the first ingredient that always breaks down in my mix. So I always had a love-hate relationship with this stuff. You can tell when it breaks down because it's not nice and light anymore in color. It's quite dark, and it will literally, I can break this, but it's very tough to break it. When it's basically going rotten, this stuff just pulls apart and breaks apart very, very easily. So in recent years, I have switched to this, which instead of a fir bark is a pine bark. This is called Orchiata. And I like the fine stuff better than the coarse stuff. Again, we don't try to mix the sizes because just like with a perlite example, it just fills in the holes. So this stuff I haven't been using it long enough to verify, but it's supposed to last 2 to 3 plus years without breaking down. as opposed to, as I said, this stuff starts to break down in like a year and a half. So I have been using a mixture of the Orchiata pine bark, the popcorn perlite, and the sphagnum moss, which seems to be working really well for my plants. There's a couple other ingredients that can be used. Now, for Nepenthes, I don't use it at all, but this is peat moss. Very cheap, but very readily available. It's pre-mixed. Sorry, I pre-mixed some perlite in here because I was doing some different carnivorous plants earlier today. But normally it would just be without the perlite, but you can mix perlite in there. So if you had to, I know some plants come out of the nursery like a ventricosa or a ventrata, and they're basically planted in peat moss. And some Nepenthes will just grow in anything. I have never had much luck at growing Nepenthes in peat moss though. It just kind of packs down and I just don't like it that much, so I've never used it. Once you get onto the technical side of things here, and you really want to be a keener, there's other ingredients. This is my mix here that I use for a lot of things. It is oyster shells and dolomite lime. I almost forgot the name there. So that is a mixture I will put in the odd Nepenthes mix. Something like, hence why I have a campanulata here. My campanulata in the wild, they grow on limestone cliffs. So you can see the oyster shell in the mix. The dolomite lime is in there too, but it basically gets lost in the mix. But you can see the oyster shells quite easily. And then a little basil shoot too, to boot. Score. Cool. So anyways, a plant like this, being it potentially likes, I'm going to say potentially because there's no real proof that it actually helps, but I don't find it hurts. So I pot up my mix, or my Nepenthes, in this sort of mix here, just like we talked about, and then I just sprinkle it on top. And when I water, some of the calcium and magnesium from the dolomite lime and from the crushed oyster shell sinks into the media, and it becomes a very alkaline mix, just like they would experience in the wild. On a different scale, this is my Attenburyi, or one of them. And these guys grow in ultramafic soils. I think I'm saying that correctly. Anyways, soils with a high, I want to say toxic metal content in it. Lots of manganese, magnesium, I think magnesium, iron, stuff like that. It makes the soil very toxic to other plants to grow and gives them more of a chance to grow. So I don't have access to ultramafic soil, but I do have access, and you're going to have to excuse this box because a little bit goes a long way for this. Laterite. So laterite is an iron-rich clay. Has some manganese in there as well. And I've already pre-washed this stuff. It's really dusty and leaves an orange soot everywhere if you don't. But just like the crushed coral and the dolomite lime from a minute ago, I would sprinkle this on the top surface area of some of my Nepenthes. And it gives it more of the ultramafic properties, I guess. Again, just like with the lime, I don't know that it really does it. Some people do it, some people don't. But it definitely doesn't seem to hurt my plants at all. So I would do that with Raja, any of the species from Paluanensis. This is Attenburyi, as I say, Argentii, stuff like that. Do a bit of research. See if your Nepenthes comes from ultramafic soils. Velosa. And yeah, it doesn't seem to hurt anything anyways. So as for Hamata, it actually just comes from nice mossy forests, and I don't do either. I just have some moss and some perlite and some, I will be putting Orchiata pine bark in there in this mix there. But that is me rambling on for nearly 10 minutes on Nepenthes mixes. The only other thing I can say or show you is sort of ratios. There's going to be no right or wrong ratio. For plants like Velosa, you're going to want to use a lot more of this. See the drainage in there? Like, that's really good drainage. For some of the cheaper species, no offense to cheaper species, they seem to grow easier in anything. Usually the more expensive the plant, the more specialized it is, and might need more thought in the media. In the most part, here's just a 1 gallon mix that I've been using. So this is sphagnum and the popcorn perlite in about the right ratio. It is about 2 handfuls of the moss and 1 handful of the perlite. And in this case, I can add some bark to it as well. Now, obviously that little handful is not enough for the entire thing, but I just want to show you kind of what it would look like with bark mixed in there as well. And that looks like, put that back over there, a pretty perfect media, just like that. So that media I would be happy with in 90% of my plants. It'd have to be a very specialized plant for me not to be happy with that. But yeah, you can play around with what works for you. I do find if you're using the fine perlite, you can use almost more of it. It doesn't go as far. But anyways, I am trying not to use that anymore. If you're buying perlite at a store, make sure it's not Miracle-Gro. Make sure it doesn't have any kind of nutrients in it whatsoever. A lot of times they try to hide fertilizers in perlites, so watch for that. But anyways, I hope you liked this video. What I'm going to do next is some care and culture and maintenance on that Hamada. So if you want to see me work on that next, make sure you subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next video.